Greetings. This is Ozie Hall, live here on TikTok. And today I am going to talk about the topic Black empowerment. Black empowerment. As I go into this discussion, let me start out by pointing out some basic information. First of all, Black Americans enjoy the highest standard of living of all other Black people in the world today. Black Americans enjoy the highest levels of freedom of all other Black people in the world today. And Black Americans enjoy the highest per capita income of all other groups of Black people in the world today. And if we look at the situation in the United States in terms of Black people, Black or African Americans, in the conditions that exist today, and the status of the empowerment of Black America, it's critical to understand its history and to be able to understand the context in which the success of Black America exists and how the success of Black America has arisen. And it is also important to understand the world stage today and the political realities that exist in the United States today. And it is also very critical for us to recognize that the success that the Black community has enjoyed has actually ebbed and flowed over the past centuries. And it has been only as a result of the struggle to maintain that position that Black people find themselves in the situation that we're in today as the most successful group of Black people on the planet. And so in terms of looking at and understanding the conditions and situation that we're in, this is not a guaranteed position. It has been challenged over and over and over and over again. And if we don't understand that, and we don't understand the nature of the challenges, then we are in danger of losing our place in history and finding ourselves at the foot of the nations of the earth. And so it's critical for us to develop an understanding of history and to recognize and understand where we are in time and space so that we can actually take action and engage in proper conduct and action in order to move forward into the future and continue to expand Black empowerment and Black progress. Let me paint a picture of where we are right now. If we look at the conditions that Black people are experiencing in terms of the success, it's critical for us to recognize that the Black community is actually consists of multiple different groups. So you have Black Christians, you have Black Muslims, you have Black liberals, Black conservatives, you have the so-called foundational Black Americans and the ADOS, you have the pretendians, you have the Black MAGA groups, you have the Black Democrats, Black Republicans, and you also have Black civil rights supporters, among many other groups. I mean, we could go into talking about the Black Moors or the Moorish Science Temple, the Nation of Islam. We could talk about the Black Hebrew Israelite Nation. We could talk about a host of other Black organizations. We could also talk about social groups like Black or professional groups like Black sociologists or Black engineers or Black lawyers. When we began to look at and break down the demographic of Black America, the 46.9 million people who identify as Black or African American, designated as people from sub-Saharan Black Africa, of sub-Saharan descent, that this is how Black people and Black Americans and African American is defined in the United States Census. When we look at the demographic of the Black community and we understand the various different interest groups, the key to Black empowerment has always been coalition building, and how the Black community has been able to build coalitions to work together toward a common interest. And usually that common interest has been based upon the common experience of oppression based upon race. And that's been the commonality, the common factor that has facilitated Black unity and Black organization and has driven Black progress and Black empowerment. And so in looking at this and understanding this history, it is very critical for us to recognize that right now, all of those structures that were put in place as a result of the Black Civil Rights Movement, as a result of those struggles against the oppression of Black people, that it was based on race, that all of those systems and structures that have been put in place, which include legal structures where the Brown versus Board of Education made it illegal for Jim Crow segregation. So Black people could no longer be legally segregated under the Constitution, which they were for 100 years. And in addition to that, in addition to the elimination of lawful segregation, Black people have experienced a number of different legal rulings and legal legislation that has structured Black empowerment. And these have been crafted and carefully designed by Black history and Black people. You could go back into history and you could see, for example, Charles Hamilton Houston, who was the main organizer for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and the regime of lawyers who came forward with the Black Civil Rights Movement and used the legal structure in order to modify the law and bring about the reversal of Jim Crow segregation from the landmark Supreme Court decision in 1886, the ruling for Jim Crow or 96 in the ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson, that the Brown versus Board of Education was something that was legally engineered and crafted and worked toward over a period of time in multiple jurisdictions by a whole team of attorneys who came together that were initially led by Charles Hamilton Houston. And then, of course, Thurgood Marshall took up the mantle and brought it to victory with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which was a landmark decision that reversed Jim Crow segregation. And then after that, Dr. Martin Luther King began to test this new law through the Montgomery bus boycott, and Dr. King and Rosa Parks and others. And then in addition to that, we see then the Civil Rights Act of 1964 come into being. And this Civil Rights Act actually established an entire regime of law, because not only did it have just a single federal law, but as a consequence of that, federal agencies established administrative regulations that prohibited discrimination on the basis of race. Uh, Anti-discrimination clauses were placed in federal contracts. There were state-level counterparts that had to be implemented as far as anti-discrimination measures. And anti-discrimination became the rule of law throughout the country in federal agencies that granted funding to states. So it involved education, it involved employment, it involved a host of areas that the federal government had administrative control over. And through these administrative regulations and offices of civil rights in all of these agencies and the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Justice, that they worked to eliminate segregation and its vestiges and racial segregation and discrimination against black people in general. And then, of course, many other groups became the recipients and beneficiaries of this success that black people experienced. So women received rights and received many opportunities as a result of the civil rights movement, and other minority groups like Asians and East Indians and a host of groups of people that were immigrants into the country all received benefits as a result of this civil rights movement, as well as white women who were marginalized and subjugated themselves. And so in terms of looking at and trying to put into context and understand this entire context of things, that there was a Black Democratic Party alliance that began with the New Deal that resulted in a systematic change and restructuring and reordering of the society and the establishment of rule of law that empowered black people and gave black people an equal footing in society along with everyone else. And of course, this was a continuing process, and it never actually brought about full equality for black people, but it did result in substantial progress for black people. So when we go back and take a look at during the time of segregation and Jim Crow segregation, you can see, for example, the shift in high school graduation rates where, by the 1990s, you had, nearly 90% of black people graduated from high school. In the early 1920s, maybe 10% of black people graduated from high school. And if you look at home ownership, maybe 10% of black people owned homes in 1910. But in 1980, 1990, 45% of black people own their own homes. You can go through and systematically look at every major indicator and category, and you can see that it is a myth that black people were better off under segregation, because there was abject poverty under segregation in the black community. And you had a few anomalous success stories, like you had two major black high schools that were considered top-notch black high schools. Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C., and Booker T. Washington High School in Atlanta, Georgia. But these schools had very limited capacity, and the vast majority, probably 99% of black people across the rest of the country experience either no high schools or very poor quality high schools. And so the ideal to look back to, say, those two schools and say that we were doing so much better under segregation is just a bold-faced lie. There's no other way to put it, and sugarcoat it. The reality is it's just a bold-faced lie and a myth that's being promoted in modern times. So when we go back and really take a look at the conditions that exist and look at the structures of progress that have been put in place, they have been put in place by a Black Democratic Alliance that really began with Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune in the National Council of Negro Women. Black women across the country organized and got together, and they were able to make reforms and changes and assert their political power and their political voice after Black women got the right to vote. And we see the major progress of the Black community occur during this particular period of time. And it has built a structure in place that now has sustained Black progress and have put Black people in the condition of progress that we have become the most successful group of Black people on the earth. And so when we begin to really examine this and understand what's happening and understand all these structures that have been put in place, today, those structures, that very system that Black people work to establish through the Black Democratic Alliance is now under attack. And what is happening is it is being systematically dismantled through the Trump administration, the MAGA movement, and the conservative movement that's going on, the alt-right movement, the rise of white supremacy, not only in the United States, but there is a global effort to revive worldwide white supremacy. And we can look at, for example, just recently, within the last 30 days, at the Munich Security Conference in Munich, Germany, Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, spoke with an international body of European countries. And one of the things that he talked about was that the European powers, the European countries, should not feel guilt or shame about slavery in their colonial past, that they should not feel any shame about this history, and that they should in fact embrace it and see it in a positive light. And so he's promoting this idea of a reunification of Western civilization, the Western civilization that was organized around the principles of the oppression of Black and brown people around the world. And so this is a quest for the revival of global white supremacy. And it disregards so much history and attempts to erase so much history because it doesn't look at some of the things that got us to where we are today. For example, if you look at what they call the Atlantic Compact, that this Atlantic Compact, it was a meeting between the president at that time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill. And they sat down together. They had this clandestine meeting. And what they did was they actually established a framework for the founding of the United Nations at the end of World War I. And what they did was they talked about the conditions that existed in the world, and they decided that colonialism should come to an end. They decided that oppression of marginalized groups of people and minorities should come to an end. And they decided there should be an international framework so that people could exercise their rights and have a voice, and that there should be universal human rights, and that people all over the world should have the right to self-determination and self-governance. And this actually ushered in a new era of time. And what happened after that is once the war concluded, the United Nations was formed. And the United Nations brought in nations from all over the world. They developed a system to rebuild and restructure the world because so much of Europe and Asia and other parts of the world had suffered all kinds of bombing and atrocities that destroyed its infrastructure and devastated its populations and placed various countries all around the world in abject poverty. And they created a system through the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, and a system to rebuild and restructure society and human civilization. And as a result of the work that they did and that they put in place, there was a new world order came into being. And this global order actually resulted in the rise of 54 independent Black African nations on the African continent. There became a global shift in the way things were done. There was civil rights movement and labor movements. And what happened is people began to gain rights and freedoms that they didn't have previously. And because World War II had created such a condition, it was the climax of conflict, of people that had been oppressed and suppressed and that were no longer willing to take it. And it resulted in World War. And so in terms of, in order to avert and prevent future World War and world global conflicts, they attempted to establish human rights and establish conditions where everyone would have an opportunity to prosper and progress. And if we look at this whole movement that came about actually started out with the first Pan-African Conference in 1900, where Black people worldwide came together in London, England, from multiple countries around the world and parts of the British Empire, the United States, etc. Black leaders all came together and they spoke out on the conditions that existed in the Black communities around the world and the atrocities being committed against Black people around the globe. They spoke out on these things and they raised the international consciousness. And this movement pushed us in the direction to ultimately there was a Universal Declaration of Human Rights passed in 1948. And then ultimately we saw major global progress occurring. But for Black America was very often at the forefront of this global push because leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois and others were at the forefront of the Pan-Africanist movement. They were the articulate spokespersons for this international movement. And so in terms of when we began to look at and understand the kinds of conditions and the fact that the United States became the leader and emerged as a world leader, and Black people in America with an alliance with the Democratic Party maintained the power position and power structure that enabled the building of this regime of laws, this regime of structure that allowed Black progress and that has resulted in Black people achieving the highest standard of living, the highest levels of freedom, and the highest per capita income of all of the Black people around the world. So when we look at this and understand it, it has a very distinctive history. And it's important for us to understand that history, to understand where we are today in time and space. Because if we fail to understand it, then we won't be prepared to defend ourselves, because these systems are under attack right now. There is an effort to erode the civil rights laws. They've already begun to try to dismantle it and restructure it. The conservative-leaning Supreme Court has struck down affirmative action and has taken action to eliminate those things that enable Black people to have some progress. And they're promoting some false notion of a meritocracy, which is a false notion. As long as you have human beings making decisions, there's going to be a subjective nature to it. And the reality of it is that diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and affirmative action were necessary tools to prevent historical discrimination that has existed for centuries, for multiple centuries. The system of white supremacy actually created a condition of implicit bias, of inherent bias that was reflected in the fact that black people, whether they were qualified or not, they still weren't going to get the job simply because of their skin color. So there were laws put in place and rules and regulations put in place that allowed some black people to be able to get in. And this is why people like Martin Luther King said, for example, that he said, well, yeah, you can't legislate love. We can't make YT people love us or care about us. So we can't legislate love, but we can stay murder. We can make it illegal to murder us. And that's pretty important too. And this is what Dr. King, for example, said. And I think the point he was trying to illustrate is that in order for black people in this country to be able to maintain its rights and its position, it needs laws in place to protect the progress of the black community. And if you look at the history of the country, that without these laws, the black community suffered. Because if you look at, for example, after the American Civil War, states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, they were majority black population states. And immediately after the Civil War, black people were elected to Congress in record numbers. You had black senators, you had blacks in Congress, and you had this major decade of black progress immediately following the Civil War. And then came the Republican sellout. And this Republican sellout, this compromise of 1877, resulted in the removal of federal troops from the South, in allowing the South to have a free hand to be able to commit terror acts against black people. And what happened is there was over 100 massacres in black communities. There was black towns and communities that were built after the Civil War were burned and looted. Blacks were terrorized. Lynching rose to an all-time high. And the federal government refused to pass an anti-lynching law. They refused to take any action to prevent these things from happening, these atrocities committed against black people. They refused to act. And by 1894, the Supreme Court affirmed Jim Crow segregation that was already been established through these acts of terror that have been taking place since right after the Civil War, and particularly escalated after the so-called Great Compromise of 1877. So when we look at this, we can see the history that unfolded, and that without a strong system in place to protect the black community, that there was open season on black folk. And by 1919, the so-called Red Summer of 1919, there were attacks on black communities. 36 different locations, countries, states around the country where there were black communities under attack in what they call the Red Summer. And black people were being attacked just to so-called put us in our place because we got too uppity after World War. Black soldiers participated in World War I. We came back patriots, and then were treated as second-class citizens once we came back into the United States. So when you began to look at this, you see the Wilmington Massacre, where there was an actual overthrow of the local elected government in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1899 to overthrow it because it was a black democratically elected government in Wilmington, North Carolina. If you look at the Tulsa Greenwood massacre, the Tulsa, Oklahoma, the rise of Black Wall Street, where black people organized and they built an independent black community that was a very successful community in business and progress and commerce. And what happened is YT mobs came in and they destroyed the city. They burned it and razed it to the ground and terrorized black people and unalived many. And you look at in Rosewood, Florida, they went in 1923. They terrorized the community, burned it and looted it, and did all kinds of atrocities against black people. And you look at these things in history, and within the historical time context, they weren't that long ago. And not only were they not that long ago, but if you look at the conditions that existed, the fact that there was this attempt to continue to suppress and oppress black people fought back. Black people organized. They sued in courts, and they worked to restructure the law, and they continued to move and make the argument to make progress. They continued to use reason and reasonableness. They worked in politics to bring about and promote change. And that after the Republican Party collapsed the economy and plunged the nation into the Great Depression, you have the period of what they call the robber barons, where they looted the economy. They ripped off the savings of poor people and even the middle class that had, like, their savings. They all got ripped off through the stock market really thefts that ended up resulting in the establishment of the Securities Exchange Commission and the Securities Act and all of those things. And what happened is that this open looting of the American people by the Republican Party allowed the market crash, and then they tried to fix it by imposing tariffs and further plunged the economy into chaos and ushered in a period called the Great Depression, where America was in deep, deep trouble as a result of the Republican policies and Republican administration. And so FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, came in with a New Deal. And this New Deal brought in social safety networks. It regulated the robber barons. It regulated those people that were ready to loot black people and loot all people in America, poor people. And he brought in policies that regulated those. And as a consequence of that, a New Deal was in place and a new social safety net was put in place. And then there was a rise of the middle class. And then there was the movement towards civil rights. And the whole structure of the civil rights movement then began to move forward and make progress. And it was this Black Democratic Alliance that established this success, that established this progress. And it was the abandonment of the Republican Party. And if you look at, for example, 1948, the Democratic Party, which traditionally the Southern Democrats were the ones who built that K organization. It was the Southern Democrats that were the oppressors of black people. And Republicans were the champions of freedom, even though they did not actually intend to free black Americans from the South. That was never part of the Republican platform. A lot of people don't really understand that. But they never intended, they were willing to let slavery go on in the South. They just didn't want to expand it west because they had other economic plans. So when we look at what happened in terms of the Republican Party and their compromise to try to stay in power, and we see the Democratic Party then raining terror on black people, and then we see a shift, because what happens is you have Northern Democrats, you have people that did not support the policies necessarily of the South. And they shifted after the Republicans basically destroyed the economy and collapsed the economy. And then what happened is these New Deal Democrats came in, and they had an alliance at first with all the Democrats. But the Southern Democrats, and they used to call it the Solid South because it was solidly Democrat, they opposed many of the positions of the New Deal Democratic Party. And then what happened is the New Deal Democratic Party actually put anti-discrimination clauses in governmental programs, and they were opposed at the state level by Southern Democrats. And so you had this tension that went on, and by 1948, Southern Democrats broke away from the Democratic Party, the New Deal Democrats, and they formed what was called the States' Rights Democratic Party. They split away and created their own separate party, and they conducted a primary against the mainstream Democratic Party, the New Deal Democrats. And they ran Strom Thurmond in 1948 as a presidential candidate against Harry Truman, the Democratic president at that time, who was running for re-election. And what they did was they ran a separate candidate, a segregationist candidate against him. And as a consequence of that, they lost. And the New Deal Democratic Party that was backed by Black America succeeded and was successful and was able to move on. And then eventually you got the desegregation of the U.S. Armed Services. Then you got Brown versus Board of Education passed. You got the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Fair Housing Act of 1968, the Minority Business Development Agency, the Community Reinvestment Act, etc. You can see the progress that took place after that, this tangible progress. And so you can see this whole regime coming out of this Black Democratic Alliance. But the States' Rights Democratic Party, instead of becoming the solid South, where it was all of the southern states were Democrat, now they're all red states. They're all Republican states because they shifted from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And people will say, oh, that's a myth, it's not true. But look at the facts. Just look at how many states were Democratic states before 1948 in the South. And then look after that and see the fact that they are now solidly red states across the South. And so in terms of looking at and understanding this reality, you can see that this shift took place if you look at, for example, you look at the data and you see that they lost in the 1948 election, the States' Rights Democratic Party. They ran Strom Thurmond, the Southern segregationist from South Carolina. He wasn't successful. But what happened is in 1962, he became, first of all, Ronald Reagan shifted from the Democratic Party and became a Republican in 1962. And then in 1964, Strom Thurmond became a Republican in 1964. Then Jesse Helms, the Southern segregationist from North Carolina, who was a staunch Southern segregationist, he became a Republican in 1970. And then you had Elizabeth Dole and Trent Lott, and you had major Democratic politicians shift parties and become Republicans. And not only that, if you look in those regions, you saw a major migration of people who were registered as Democratic voters, shifted and became Republicans. And so you can see this major shift that takes place, and you can see this condition that exists as far as Black progress is concerned. And you can recognize the fact that when we look at this history and understand this history, that all during this time, there were major attempts to dismantle the progress of the Black community and the regime of law and structure that was put in place that was the foundation of Black progress, that they've worked to undermine this consistently since it was established and as it was being established as it goes along. And of course, they've got all kinds of myths that they have created, for disinformation. They're basically liars. They thrive on promoting lies and disinformation in order to trick you, so that, instead of talking the truth and trying to be right and do the right thing and to really support Black progress, their whole mission has been to undermine Black progress, to use lies and disinformation. So they'll make up these things and say, well, you were better off under segregation. And they will say, well, the Democratic Party, they broke up the Black family. the Democratic Party this, the Democratic Party that. And when you actually analyze it with actual scrutiny, you realize that it's all lies. It's all part of a disinformation campaign. And when you begin to critically examine it and recognize this fact, then you begin to realize where we're really at and what's really going on. And so, when you look at this idea that the Democrats somehow destroyed the black family, if you go back and you look at the shift in, if you go back and look at the shift in family structures, you look at, say, for example, 1950, the out of wedlock birth in the black community was like 7%. By 1960, it was 27%. It had a major leap. And if you look at that, you didn't have black people that had access to some of the programs that they claim actually resulted in causing this dismantling of the black family. Black people didn't participate in those and have those at that point. And then not only that, this shift also took place in the YT community, had a major shift in terms of the number of out of wedlock births. And it had more to do with other sociological factors that had to do with women's rights. It had to do with women becoming liberated and independent. It had to do with the elimination of shotgun weddings. It had to do with restructuring and advancement in the social order. It wasn't a result of some destructive force, but they characterize it as such. And they do that for the purpose of disinformation. And so when we began to really take a look at and analyze, we see just so many things happening. They promoted a lot, even like, for example, Kamala Harris ran for president against Donald Trump in the last election. And what they did was they targeted the black community. They used troll farms and disinformation campaigns, and they promoted this idea that Kamala Harris, as the Attorney General of the state of California, was responsible for the incarceration of thousands of black men on minor marijuana charges. And it created an outrage in the black community. And you had all these black people, especially black men, feeling like, well, Kamala Harris, I can't vote for her. I can't support her. So either, they voted for Trump, or they said, look, I can't vote at all because I can't vote for her and I can't vote for Trump. So that, in essence, became a vote for Trump by them not voting at all, right? But it was a Republican strategy. And so what they did was they pushed this ideal about Kamala Harris locking up black men, when in reality, if you actually look at the situation, the Attorney General of the state of California had absolutely nothing to do with black men being incarcerated on minor marijuana charges, because the Attorney General actually handled a whole different type of responsibilities at the state level of government. The decision to lock up black men on minor marijuana charges had to do with the actions of the state legislature and local elected district attorneys who were not part of the Kamala Harris's administration. There were independent local district attorneys at the county level and local elected district judges. Local elected district judges and local elected district attorneys engaged in the conduct that resulted in a massive incarceration of black men on minor marijuana charges. Had nothing to do with Kamala Harris at all. And so when we go back and examine the whole situation, they used the disinformation campaign. They circulated this clip that they indicated or spin it to say that, well, Kamala Harris doesn't support reparations for black people. And they put this idea out there and said, well, she won't say that she supports reparations and she's this and that. And, she doesn't support us, so we can't support her. And that's the narrative that was put out there by Republican troll farms, in essence, conservative think tanks, conservative troll farms, put this disinformation out in the black community, and many black men particularly swallowed this up and accepted this as true. And they didn't vote for Kamala Harris. They either supported Trump or they didn't vote at all, which was effectively a vote for Trump. So whether they directly voted for Trump or not vote at all benefited Trump, if you understand the election process from a math standpoint. But the fact of the matter is that Kamala Harris was a co-sponsor with Cory Booker of S 1083. It was the Senate version of House Resolution 40, which was the reparations bill. So she was a co-sponsor, a Senate co-sponsor of the reparations bill. So for people to say that she didn't support it and no media corrected it and said, oh, wait a minute, this can't be true because she's a co-sponsor of the legislation. You didn't see that in the media. Why didn't you see that in the media? Why? It's because you have conservatives taking control of the media. They're purchasing control and ownership in all of the major media outlets. And so they're pushing a narrative. It's all part of pushing a narrative that is an anti-black narrative, an anti-democratic narrative, because this alliance between the Black and Democratic Party is the threat that they fear. They fear Black progress continuing because of this Black Democratic alliance. And where we are today, we are in a condition today where Black people have been divided. And as a result of being divided, we have diluted our political power. And because we've diluted our political power, we have given over to our enemies the ability to dismantle Black progress, to set us backwards. And so when we begin to look at this divide in the Black community over ideology, if we understand the nature of from whence we've come, if we understand the history from which we've come, and understand where we are in time and space and what is actually happening to dismantle that progress that we all take for granted today, that we will realize that it is through this Black Democratic alliance. So the challenge becomes of Black people being able to mobilize in unison to the extent where our voice matters, where we have the ability to elect and determine who gets in office, where we have the ability to determine what the political policy is going to be. And this is the challenge that we have right now. And that is reaching the level of consciousness to recognize the requirement for Black unity, for Black empowerment to occur, for Black people to move forward and to make progress. And so when we see small groups of Black people, you know, they run up under the wing of YT folks and all those kinds of things in the Republican Party. And so you got more and more Black people that are Black MAGAs, and they say all kinds of ridiculous things when you really listen to them. And many, they have no real clue of the actual history of Black people. And they're just disconnected from the reality of the Black experience. And this, a lot of it is a result of the fact that many parents, we didn't have a system in place to promote Black history in public education. So many Black people did not really get a good solid grounding in Black history. So many of our children grew up and they didn't know much about Black history. They didn't have a good understanding of what happened to us or understand the struggles and even have the ability to fully understand in its context, in its historical context, what is happening right now. And so they have bought into some of the disinformation campaigns and the rhetoric. So you got people that are now claiming they're FBA and they're ADOS. You got people claiming that they are black mega, and that they are conservative, and that they are taking all these kinds of positions that they don't really fully understand the history of or recognize the origin of many of these things, and to recognize that they're working against their own self-interest. And this is why it's critical for us to learn this history and to be able to talk about the history and to be able to share the information so that we can debunk the disinformation campaign, because black people are being constantly bombarded with disinformation through social media. There's a whole system in place to bombard black people with disinformation, to destabilize our identity, to get us fighting among ourselves so that we're disunited and disorganized. And so that by keeping us fighting among ourselves, they're able to maintain power. They're able to move forward the policies that they want to further and further disenfranchise us. So they are now trying to gerrymander away black majority election districts so that we don't have representation in Congress. And of course, they did this before, and between 1901 in 1929, there wasn't a single black person in the United States Congress, House or Senate, because they ran us out. They used violence, they used poll tax, they used literacy tests, they used all kinds of disinformation campaigns in order to disenfranchise black people. And so we were a whole generation without representation in Congress. And so you look at that period of time and look at what they're doing now and the parallels between what they did then and what they're doing now. Same thing. You got the president calls on Texas to gerrymander election districts. Why? Because he's trying to eliminate some Democratic seats, including some black seats. And so when you begin to take a look at what is happening around the country, then like North Carolina, for example, they gerrymander away a black election district for Congress, Congressman Don Davis. They gerrymander his district away so that it cannot not be a black district because it was a black majority district. And so if you look around the country, this is what they're doing. They're doing the same playbook. They don't have anything really new, and you look at what they're doing and how it's working in so many different places. Why? Because we have a generation disconnected from our history, disconnected from the truth. And because we don't understand the true history, that we are out of touch with reality. And what happens is we're not effective in dealing with what is actually the challenges that we have, because we don't understand where we are in time and space. So you have black people, many black people that are kissing up and supporting their enemies against their own interest. And so you got all these black folk that came out and said, oh, well, they're black mega and they support black mega. But how many black people did Trump appoint to a cabinet level position? 1. Obama had 8. Biden had 7. Bill Clinton had 8. Even George Bush had 4. The younger, the father, George Bush, only had 1. Reagan had 1. And traditionally, there was only always 1. So Trump is a setback because we got 1 black cabinet member who really technically is totally disconnected from the black community, the mainstream black community. And so in terms of looking at and understanding where we are and seeing the conditions that exist right now, there is a need for black people to begin to organize and to come together, because if we look at the United States' democratic system, there's an effort to erode democracy. There's an effort to curtail voting rights and civil rights, and they got all kinds of methods now to try to disenfranchise people. They want you to prove your citizenship. They want you to do all these things that, in spite of the fact that there's no evidence that there's any widespread voter fraud. And the only major voter fraud that's ever been detected has been the voter fraud that was committed by Republicans. And so in terms of looking at this and understanding where we are And then we see now this shift in control over the media outlets are now being acquired by conservatives who support YT supremacy and that have anti-black positions. We take a look at where we are, and right now the black community is divided. And what in the past has always been our common ground as the black community, whether we were, no matter what our political ideology, no matter what our religion, no matter what other social structures we were involved in or part of, the one thing we had in common was the recognition of anti-black discrimination. We recognized the fact that black people were being subjected to discrimination. We were being marginalized and targeted on the basis of race. And so race was always the central tenet that enabled us to understand that we were in fact targets, whether we wanted to be or not. That's where we found ourselves. And it was this recognition and understanding that we were being targeted based on race. Now, we might not have any preference or care about race at all, or not even think about race. But people on the outside, there's a whole group, this a dominant group in society, looks at us as different, as separate because we're black. And they treat us in a way that's discriminatory against us because we're black. And so as a result of that, we were the last hired, the first fired. As a result of that, they redlined black communities so that we could put money in the bank, but the banks wouldn't lend any money to help us develop our communities. So we had lack of access to capital. We paid more for groceries. We paid higher insurance premiums. We had a host of discriminatory actions against us that were structured and institutionalized in the society. And as a consequence of that, black people were constantly under attack. We were marginalized. And we constantly had to run this race handicapped. You know, it's like somebody holding us back, that white folks could get out and they got a big head start on us because they were able to inherit generational wealth. They had all these structures in place that favored them. They had YT privilege. They could go to the bank and get a loan. And they had all of these systems in place that favored them. And black people did not. We didn't have a support system. We didn't have any inherent structures within the society built that was for us. And, you know, we didn't get 40 acres and a mule when we got out of slavery. And we didn't get the kind of support. We had to bootstrap it over and over again. And even when we had success bootstrapping it, they then, YT mobs came in and burned and looted our communities, destroyed our progress, destroyed the homes we built, set the crops on fire, and terrorized us at the voting booth so that we could not have progress as a group of people. And this is the history. And this is the reality that we have to recognize and understand, that it's not over. That the things that happened that didn't happen long ago, but we can look and see that some of these things are still happening today. So you can see racial profiling by police. The average black person, you go into black communities and, you know, black people, they recognize the existence of racial profiling because most black men particularly have experienced being racially profiled by police. Most black men of driving age have been pulled over for being black and for no other reason. And so there's even studies that were done under the Obama administration. There was about 100 different pattern and practice lawsuits all across the country through the Office of Civil Rights, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, because what they did was they identified, like, for example, after the Michael Brown unaliving in Ferguson, Missouri, they did a study and they found that black people were racially profiled. Now, this is a professional study that's examining objective facts, and they determined that the black community was targeted and racially profiled on the basis of race. And resources were extracted from the black community in fines and fees and all these kinds of things that harassing black community and black people. Citizens were targeted by the police, and it was sanctioned by the police department. It was sanctioned by the city government. And so in terms of, you see this study in Ferguson, then you see the same study with the same results in Chicago and Baltimore and all of the major cities all across the United States. And then black people that were saying, well, racial profiling, and then conservatives saying, well, you're not racially profiled. There's none of that going on. And then all of a sudden now there's 100 studies that confirm that it was in fact going on. And these were studies that are professional studies that are objective, doing an objective analysis of what actually was going on. So it's confirmed that black people weren't just flying off the handle, that this is what black people were experiencing. And this is recent. This is in the last, 10, 15 years that this is happening. And so in terms of looking at this fact, when the Trump administration came in, they actually eliminated all of these consent decrees. They dropped all these lawsuits. They dropped all of this and promoted business as usual. So they dismantled all of that during the first administration of the Trump administration. Most black people aren't really conscious of understanding just how far we have fallen. You take a look at this and you see, even insurance coverage for black people and black people getting access to health insurance and all that. Now the effort to dismantle that, to make it unaffordable for people who's going to, and it's going to disproportionately impact black people. I could go on and look at all of these things, but the fact of the matter is that there's a midterm election coming up. And during this midterm election, some things are going to be decided as to how this existing regime of government is going to move forward, and whether or not there will be any restraints put on them, whether they will be able to continue to dismantle black progress that they're doing systematically. 350,000 black women have lost their jobs, and within the last year. So when we began to look at and understand where we really are and what is really going on, and recognize what we have to do, we have to be able to come together and look at what happened to black people and what is happening to black people, and understand what we have in common, what our common interests are, so that we can then take collective action, because we've always made the most progress. If you look at black people making progress, you see Shirley Chisholm run for president, and she didn't win the presidency, and it was probably very clear to her at that time and people around her that she wasn't going to win. But what she did was she brought thousands and thousands of new black voters into the tent. And all these new black voters that came in supported this Black Democratic Alliance, and it gave the black community more leverage with the Democratic Party. It enabled the black community to get more policies passed. It allowed the black community to leverage its support and its power in order to make black progress. Then Jesse Jackson came along, and he ran for president in 1984 and 1988. And he brought in millions of new black voters. And then the Million Man March came in 1995, and 1.5 million new black voters, primarily black men, voted for the very first time. And so after this, you see you see Bill Clinton get elected, and he brings 8 black cabinet members in, the highest number in recorded history at the time. And if we take a look at what was happening during that particular time period, what we'll see is that this progress that black people made in terms of black political alliance, it resulted in a Black Democratic Party chairperson, Ron Brown. And then you had blacks appointed as the Secretary of Commerce and all kinds of major positions. And you saw unprecedented black progress taking place at that time. So when we began to dismantle and look at the actual facts of black progress, and most, they have such a disinformation campaign against Barack Obama, most people don't realize that there was a 2006 Black Leadership Summit where they established an agenda of items that the black community thought important for the next president of the United States. And if you look at President Obama's record, Obama systematically addressed each of these one by one and made substantial progress in every area of progress that was part of that agenda. But instead of that, black people talk about stuff that wasn't part of that agenda, or they just fall for disinformation that's being promoted to them on social media. This part of a disinformation campaign in order to divide the black community and get black people to go against each other and work against the mutual progress of black America. And so where we are today is we are in a situation where, in order for us to move forward and make significant progress, we're going to have to really come together. And the only way that's really fully going to happen is if we begin to truly and honestly understand our history, to understand where we are in time and space. Because until we can actually see what is going on and the things that they did and that they are doing now, it'll be very difficult for us to come together. And that's why it's so important to study black history. This is why it's so important. When I talk about studying black history, I'm talking about studying black history at a detailed level that is not this unprecedented. Because when we look at the history I just been unfolding and developing and how it's been documented, the black community has not had access to just so much important information. And so, the ideal that, black history is critical. I want to mention a book. I wrote this book called New Black America History Premiere. And what I do is, in that book, I attempt to try to lay out some of the things that I've shared. I try to shift the paradigm so that we can understand black history that's grounded in factual-based information. And because that which happened in the past, that which we believe happened in the past, conditions the living present and therefore the future. So history is not a dead thing. And it's important for us to recognize that which happened in the past grounds us in reality, and that which we believe happened in the past, if it is built in mythology and half-truths and is not true, that could lead us on a path of destruction because we will be out of touch with reality. And this is why Professor Sheikh Anta Diop, for example, pointed out, he says that we must rescue and reconstruct black history, not on a protest posture, but based upon facts and empirical evidence. And so when we look at going forward, it's very critical for us to get it right. It's to understand this history. And most of my books are available. I've got 14 books published on Amazon. And you can just put my name in Ozie Hall and find my books on Amazon. So thank you for taking the time to listen, and be blessed and have a wonderful day.